Welcome. My name's Althea Brooks, and I'm Senior Director of Lifetime Learning in the University of Virginia's Office of Engagement. I'm pleased you can join us for this program on Reimagining the Declaration of Independence. We're delighted to have two scholars share with us today. We received many questions in advance of this program, which we've shared with the speakers. If you have a question during the presentation, please enter it in the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. You will find resources in the webinar chat box, which we'll share with you near the end of the program. This talk is being recorded and will be posted in the Lifetime Learning's podcast library in a week or so. Now, allow me to introduce our moderator for today's talk. John Ragosta is the inaugural James Madison Fellow at Montpelier and the Fellow at the Virginia Humanities. Since 2012, he's served as the faculty director of the UVA's Lifetime Learning Summer Jefferson Symposium. John previously served as interim director of the International Center of Jefferson Studies at Monticello. He's taught law and history at the University of Virginia, George Washington University, Hamilton, Oberlin, and Randolph Colleges. John's most recent book is For the People, for the Country, Patrick Henry's Final Political Battle. It was published by UVA Press in 2023. He's also the author of Religious Freedom, Jefferson's Legacy, America's Creed, and several other outstanding works. John is a double hoop. He holds both a PhD and a JD from UVA. He received an honorary doctorate from Hampton-Sydney College. Previously, John was a partner at Dewey Ballantine, LLC in Washington, D.C. Little known fact about John, he's also a beekeeper. Scholars, welcome. Please begin your conversation.
Althea, thank you. It's always such a pleasure to be at a UVA event, even if only virtually. So we're very happy to be here today. You know, in 3 weeks, less than 3 weeks, we're going to have the 250th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence. And I like a birthday party as much as the next guy. But at a time when our nation faces great challenges, our democracy faces challenges, we thought it was a wonderful opportunity to get together and to rethink and relearn and maybe reimagine the Declaration of Independence in some ways. So that's what we wanted to do today. And I'm very pleased to say I have with me today Christa Dierksheide, the Jefferson Scholars Foundation professor in the UVA Department of History. Also, most recently, the co-author of Jefferson's Wolf, a Founding Father's Troubling Answer to the Problem of Slavery. Christa, welcome. You know, one of the issues we always have when talking about history with people is we know what happened. They didn't. We know what's going to happen on July 4th. But of course, the colonists didn't in that whole earlier period. I saw an advertisement the other day for the new movie coming out, Young Washington, about George Washington's involvement in the French and Indian War. So why don't we start there? When the French and Indian War ends in 1763, what did Americans think about Britain and about being British?
Yeah, I think that's a great question and a great way to start this wonderful program, John, because I think a lot of us, our kind of default reaction to a discussion about American independence, about the Declaration, about 1776, is to really think that it was sort of inevitable. Like there were these sort of overwhelming forces that were going to culminate in American nationhood and independence. But actually, if we look a little bit more closely at this decade that you're talking about, the 1760s, we find that that actually was not at all the case. And in fact, and I think it's important to underscore that Britain had 26 colonies in North America in 1776. Only 13 revolted. So I think it really is incumbent upon us to really sort of look through the microscope at the origins, reasons, and causes for independence in this lead up. But you're absolutely right to point to the French and Indian War, also known as the Seven Years' War, a global imperial war between Britain and France. This was an enormous war, right, fought in the interior of North America, in the Caribbean, and India, racked up a huge debt for Britain. And this is their big problem in 1763. How are we going to pay down the debt? And colonists, unfortunately, are caught in the crosshairs of that urgent financial crisis.
Absolutely. So we have very quickly the Stamp Act. But, the amazing thing to me is how much Americans at that point in time view themselves as tied to London, not tied to the other colonies. The fashion comes from London, the music comes from London, the books come from London. People celebrate King George's birthday,
Mhm.
and they think that's wonderful. They're very proud. We're British. Um, but then there's this progression of events. I mentioned the Stamp Act, 1765,
Mhm.
Townshend duties, 1767, Boston Massacre, 1770. But it's always struck me they still think they're British, even after that Stamp Act and Townshend duties and Boston Massacre. What changes?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a great question. And I think a lot of those viewing will think, as we're mentioning all of these taxes, the kind of broad umbrella of taxation without representation, right, is the kind of key juggernaut of the era. But I think you're exactly right. We need to kind of pull back a little bit and remind ourselves that these colonists aren't staging these protests and airing their grievances because they want to be separate from Britain. It's actually because they want to be a part of Britain in the future. What they're really clamoring for is a return to what they imagine to be the golden age of the British Empire. And by that, I mean the era before the Seven Years' War, before debt, before taxation on this new taxation, which I think is an important point on these colonies. So they're, by all means, as you're saying, identifying as British, consuming British goods. We need to remember that Thomas Jefferson, for example, is a loyal member of the British Empire for 33 years, right? They imagine themselves as subjects of the king and proud subjects of the king. So, but their grievances are just an effort to try to roll back what they view as these sort of tyrannical parliamentary measures, not an aim to try to separate themselves from the empire.
Well, and something you said I think is worth emphasizing. People often say, well, it was about the taxes. Well, no, not really. It was about the taxes without representation.
Mhm.
They paid their own taxes in Virginia and New York and Massachusetts, and they weren't complaining about those. The problem was those folks over in Parliament who are taxing them without anyone being represented. So, okay, we have a slow boil, you might think of, or sort of a simmering that's going on in the 1760s. And then you mentioned they're consuming British goods. And of course, one of the most important is tea. I've got my mug of British tea with me today.
Good.
And the Tea Act, so we got a simmering, everything's simmering. And the Tea Act and what comes afterwards seems to bring that to a boil. The thing that's always surprised me about the Tea Act is it actually lowered the price of tea.
Right.
But
Yes.
but that really brings people into the streets.
It does. I mean, a lot of these measures, as they get increasingly draconian between 1763, which is when the first um, new sort of imperial laws passed, the Proclamation of 1763, and 1775, right? These really escalate and anger a more broader and more broad sort of swath of the colonial population. And you're absolutely right about the tea, right? The Tea Act. And in particular, in the wake of the Boston Tea Party, right, the passage of this slate of really horrible acts that were later understood to be the coercive acts, which actually suspend the Massachusetts Charter, right? They passed the Quartering Act. They shut down the port of Boston. So all of these measures, again, it's not just taxation without representation is kind of the tip of the iceberg. This is an imposition of parliamentary power within colonies where it had never existed before. That's actually kind of a really critical point. That colonies had largely assumed they had authority over themselves. The fact that Parliament is injecting itself into their colonies, into their daily lives, imposing the military on them in some cases, shutting down their commerce, dissolving their assemblies. So it's a violation of civil liberties and a new form of empire that they've never seen before,
Right.
and they don't want it.
And an important part of that, I mean, let's go back to where we started. I said, we've got a simmering, and
Yeah.
things are happening to turn that simmering to boiling. It didn't have to happen. Things could have gone, you could have quieted the simmering. One thing that really, so the Tea Act and the Tea Party and the intolerable acts, the coercive acts. So now we're boiling, seizing the weapons.
Yeah.
You have the British governors in both Massachusetts and in Virginia, and there's issues in New York where they're seizing gunpowder in particular. They're trying to seize the weapons in Massachusetts. And, on the 18th of April in 75, we have Paul Revere riding out, and we have Lexington and Concord the next day. What does it, and I love, by the way, of all of the historic sites I've visited, my favorite place to visit is Concord, feeling really close to what's happening. I mean, you can sit above the North Bridge and look down. How big an impact does that have to take this simmering to boiling over?
Yeah, no, I think that it's actually really important. It is a kind of turning point in the way that colonists have thought about and acted in this war. I mean, it's important to sort of underscore that Jefferson in 1774 was still saying, I'd rather be dependent on Great Britain than on no nation, right? So this idea of being dependent on the mother country of Britain was still a good thing as late as 1774 for a lot of people. But the outbreak of violence at Lexington and Concord, bloodshed, is part of what turns people toward the idea of separating from the British Empire. And in fact, to your earlier excellent point, it helps the colonies to think more collectively. Because prior to the outbreak of this violence in 75, they're thinking more individually, about New York, about South Carolina. They're not thinking about the 13 colonies as any kind of whole.
Right. And we want to come back to that when we get to the
Okay.
Declaration. Thinking Americans, we're Americans. That's critically
Yeah.
important. And one of the things that happens after Lexington and Concord, I know you've seen them. If you look at the broadsides, the newspaper accounts, historians argue we really don't know who shot first at Lexington and Concord and how that happened. But the way it's being reported in the newspaper is, that John Parker has got his militiamen there. He tells them to disperse, and suddenly the British are shooting them in the backs, and there's Americans dead. And we have that blow up. April of 75. We then have George Washington is appointed in the summer of 75, and we now have an army. I think the other critical thing we ought to talk about before we get to the Declaration is common sense. Common sense. Thomas Paine, January of 70, because up to that point, as you say, Jefferson's writing in 74, no, we want to be British, we're British. In 75, they're really worried about, should we be appointing an army? Does it make sense to support those crazies in Massachusetts? And are we Americans? Thomas Paine writes Common Sense in January of 76. And I was looking again, we don't really know how many copies of that thing are sold, but a lot. Estimates run anywhere from 80,000 to 400,000 at a time when there's only 2.5 million people in the 13 colonies. That includes 500,000 enslaved. So common sense is everywhere.
Absolutely. Absolutely. It's flying off the shelves. It's a bestseller. Yeah. It would be a New
Absolutely.
York Times bestseller if it
It
were
goes
published.
viral. It goes,
Yeah.
why does common sense, what's in common sense that grabs people?
Well, I think it's a really important text, and I'm sure that many in the audience read it in high school, this sort of seminal text, right? It's 46 pages. It's very accessible, easy to read. It makes a sort of argument that seems very commonsensical, right? Why should this expansive North American mainland sort of constellation of colonies be dependent on this tiny island? And I think it departs from previous really legal arguments and constitutional arguments that Jefferson and other elites are making um, for independence or even for a continued relationship with Britain. And that is not going to be clear to the vast majority of sort of middling and lower British Americans. So common sense has a real agenda, a political strategy, and that is mobilizing ordinary Americans to try to join the Patriot side. And I think it does do that, right? Because so many people buy this and read it and find its common sense argument convincing in a way that the legal constitutional arguments just, had fallen over them.
Right. And one of the things he does so effectively, Paine goes after the king.
Yes.
Paine, because up to that point, again, we may talk about this a little bit more, that people are saying, well, we want the king to save us from Parliament. But
Yes.
Paine goes after the king, and he said, at one point he says, well, so often we have had an ass as a lion, because the king was supposed to be the lion of empire. In America, the law is king. And Paine has this wonderful image. He says, well, what you ought to do in America when we're independent is take a book of the laws, put the crown on top of the book of the laws, because in America, the law is king, and then break that crown into pieces and send pieces to each one of the colonies, so Americans will understand we're never going to have a king in America. No kings in America. So that really motivates people. And as you say, it people can understand that.
Yes, absolutely.
In a
And
way.
it's worth saying that it emerges, Paine's text emerges, in the midst of 74 and 75 when colonial angst has turned from Parliament to the king, right? That is, we're no longer going to appeal to Parliament to try to retract these horrific new laws. We're instead going to appeal to the king and ask the king to curb the sort of tyrannical Parliament. And that's what Jefferson's summary view is about. That's what the Olive Branch petition is about in 1775. And certainly Paine goes a step further than that. Is not appealing to the king, is simply criticizing him as not acting like a king who embraces the rule of law.
Right. And that's critical. That's a very good translation. Let's get to the Declaration, because that's a critical step. You
Yep.
mentioned, Jefferson's in 1774, Jefferson's writing the summary review of the rights of British North America. And he's reflecting what the whole debate had been about for 10 years, that maybe the king will save us from Parliament. Parliament's doing us bad, but we want the king to save us.
Exactly.
And as long as that's the mindset, what you get is not independence. What you get is a Commonwealth of Nations. Like Canada, we become like Canada, we become like Australia. And Joseph Galloway, delegate from Pennsylvania, that's what he's arguing for. He says, look, the king, he's our king. I talked about pictures of the king. Americans all over the colonies had images of the king up in their house. And so one of the things that's striking about the Declaration is Jefferson's not talking about Parliament. No. Jefferson's going, the king did this, the king did that, the king is a tyrant. And it's this dramatic shift, which, I think very much is Paine driven, common sense driven. And Jefferson's realized, I can't be saying what I said in 74 anymore, because we don't get independent. If we're going to be independent, we have to break with the king, and America has to get out of that. Okay, so we've got the Declaration. So we're now on the Declaration. What did it do in 1776? I mean, we read it today, and it's got different parts. Why we get the Declaration, and what does it do?
Yeah, I mean, I'm sure, many of us here today grew up and still think of the Declaration as being this iconic document, right? The nation's creed, its touchstone, it's a kind of universalizing treatise. But I think it's also important, and one of the reasons we wanted to do this seminar was so that we could discuss what the Declaration actually sought to do sort of on the ground in real time in 1776, because we think that sometimes the practicalities of this document get forgotten as we sort of, look mostly at the second paragraph and those important words. So I think thinking about this document as something that Jefferson's writing right in the summer of 76 and June of 76 in this Philadelphia boarding house. He's turning to Locke, he's turning to Grotius, Vattel, Pufendorf, all these legal theorists to try to make a case for independence. And I think the question is where does this document need to work? I think it needs to work in a couple of different ways. So we might start first with the way it needs to work domestically, and that is it needs to mobilize people for war. It is a document that has to convince people to fight against the king, right, and his allies, including enslaved people, Native American allies, and the Hessians. Because historians now know that only about a third of the population in British North America was totally on the Patriot side. Another fifth were loyalists. The remaining percentage were on the fence. So Jefferson knows he has his work cut out for him. He has got to write a vitriolic, very persuasive document that inspires people not necessarily toward natural rights, but to pick up arms and fight against the British.
Well, one of the things that's frustrating, by the way, on the 1/3, I think you're a pessimist like John Adams. I always thought it was a little higher than that, but the point is true. There's an awful lot of people on the fence. There's a lot of loyalists. And one of the things that's always struck me about this declaration, to your point about rallying people to fight, the declaration, so July 4th, Congress votes on it. It's printed that night. The Dunlop broadsides. We were talking earlier. We've got a copy in the UVA library, in the basement of the library. One of the very rare Dunlop broadsides printed that night. It's then spread. It's sent around. Yeah. And some things happen. And the one that's so striking to me, George Washington, who's sitting in New York, waiting for an invasion of 35,000 British and Hessian soldiers, some of the best army in the world, when he's sitting there with a bunch of raw recruits who don't really know quite what they're doing yet. And he gets that declaration and he orders the troops to assemble. He orders all the troops to assemble on July 9th. The commanders of the various brigades and regiments have the declaration read to the troops.
Yeah, exactly.
And the image of that, here's these young men, they're all men, I suppose. We do have women camp followers, but these young men with guns from different colonies, they had always seen themselves. I'd seen myself as being from Massachusetts. I saw myself as being from New York. I see myself as a Virginian or a Pennsylvanian. And they're standing there in formation as somebody reads this Declaration of Independence. And as you say, those soaring words of the second paragraph, and we're going to get back to those principles here in a minute, but also the list of the king did this, the king is a tyrant. And what happens?
Well, I mean, I think the important point here is that Jefferson, right? I mean, what you're saying about it being read to the troops, this is a document written to be heard. Okay, yes. We know that Jefferson is really the most sophisticated stylist of his era. He is writing this document because he knows it is going to be read aloud, as well as being printed in newspapers and sent abroad. But the fact that it needs to hit you in the ear is actually a critical piece of this. And the kind of abuses that he's laying out of the king, of the king's allies, are really meant to mobilize people because of fear. They're afraid their civil liberties are violated. They're afraid that enslaved people and Native American people are going to slaughter them. So he's trying to build up those fears as a kind of motivator for Americans to join the patriot cause, think of themselves collectively for the first time, and try to defeat, and this is the kind of crazy part of all this, the world's most powerful empire.
Okay, so they read this, and then so you're giving us the background of what it's doing intellectually. Mm-hmm. The other thing is it works.
Hmm.
And, after they read that declaration, a bunch of the troops run down to the square in New York and pull down the statue of King George and melt it down. And people all over the 13 colonies, again, when we were talking before the program, in a lot of courthouses, in a lot of churches, you still have the king's coat of arms,
Yes.
up above the bench, up above the pulpit. They're tearing it down and they're burning it, which so this mind shift, this mindset. But then that causes a problem. That's the cart before the horse problem. The other audience that you alluded to earlier is, what about the international audience?
Yes. Yeah. So, and this is, again, I think, because we learn about the Declaration in this era very early, in grade school and high school, we don't necessarily think of how sort of ludicrous the claim is on the part of Jefferson and his allies to go into a war, to make war on this enormously powerful empire that has this navy and this army that are really unparalleled at the time. In fact, and I think this is maybe what you're suggesting, it would have been far more prudent for Jefferson and the others of the Continental Congress to wait for treaties with France, with Spain, with the Dutch Republic before saying, Britain, we're going to fight this war. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, it's a catch 22. It's a catch 22 because if you don't declare independence,
Yeah.
France and Spain and Netherlands, they don't want to help you out if you're just going to be British.
Mhm.
But if you do declare independence and they don't help you out, then you've got to try to fight Britain on your own. This is, Patrick Henry. We haven't talked about one of my current guys. Patrick Henry is sometimes accused of being opposed to the Declaration of Independence, which I don't think is quite fair. But he does say he's very cautious. He's like, wait a minute. Should we be declaring independence first, or should we first get that treaty with France? Because we've already sent, we've got people in France. Franklin goes to France. Dean is over in France. Lee.
Yeah, and I think it's worth saying though that there's a big contingent in the Continental Congress that is sort of really hoping for reconciliation, right? They don't want the declaration to sort of go too over the top, and we can talk about this more later. But that's the reason that the passage on the slave trade gets deleted. There is real tangible hope among a lot of these delegates that there will be a reconciliation in the future. There are also a lot of people who are not embracing this declaration. In fact, and we talked about this a few days ago, in New York, loyalists draft and sign their own Declaration of Dependence to the king, right? So they're venerating the king in contrast to the kind of material act of bringing the king down that you're describing in all of these towns and cities. So this is a very fraught moment in American history where we can imagine kind of the future unfolding in many different directions, many of them very dark, actually.
Absolutely. And it's scary
Yes.
because, they do the declaration July 4th, 1776. We don't get that alliance with France until after Saratoga, which isn't going to be till October 77. It's not till 78. We know that so it's almost 2 years later before things start looking up with France. Well, let's get to the principles. Let's get to that second paragraph. Let's get to what everybody knows.
Can we just spend 2 seconds on the first paragraph really quick?
Oh, I definitely want to talk about that. I was going to do the second first, but let's go ahead. Let's talk about the first paragraph because I love talking about that.
Okay.
Go ahead.
Well, I mean, it sort of is a segue from the kind of international dimension we've been talking about, and that is, and I think we don't think about this a lot of the time, but Jefferson again has a really tall order here in trying to legitimize this project of independence, not only to Britain, but to the other nations, particularly in Europe, right? So the first paragraph, which we normally gloss over
Yeah.
to get to the second, right? It seems unimportant. But in fact, and I'm going to say something sort of wild here, uh, the second paragraph is what we know and hold dear, but in 1776, it's the first paragraph that changed the world because it's the first paragraph that establishes the American nation. It had not existed anywhere before. Jefferson inaugurates it in those opening lines. Um, and not only that, does he say that this is a new people, a nation, a unified people? That people needs to be recognized by foreign powers, right? In fact, it's not just that, they're also members of what he calls the other powers of the earth, right? So in seceding from the British Empire, he imagines in that first paragraph that this newly constituted nation is now equal and in a kind of union with powers like France, like the Dutch Republic, like Spain. And he's doing this because, in order for this project to be truly legitimate, these foreign powers have to recognize and sign treaties with the new United States. Without those treaties, without international recognition, there is no nation. So that paragraph is critical at this moment in time.
Absolutely. And Jefferson, of course, nobody is better with the pen than Jefferson. He's so good at putting it in. Even before you get to the point you're making, you alluded to my favorite part of the first paragraph, when in the course of human events it
Yeah,
becomes necessary for one people.
exactly.
And for
Not
him to
13
say,
colonies, right? One people.
yeah, one people, this is extraordinary.
Never
It,
been said before.
never been said before. When the people show up at the Continental Congress in Philadelphia, more of those delegates had been to London than had been to Philadelphia before the Continental Congress. They thought of themselves as British. If you're Virginian, those guys from Massachusetts, those people from South Carolina, we don't like them. We certainly don't like the people from Rhode Island. For Jefferson to say we're one people
Mhm.
is declaring we're Americans. The whole idea of this is one nation. And again, that's why the image of those troops lined up, just hearing that first line
Yeah.
must have been extraordinary.
Yeah, and again, I think it's just worth emphasizing the way you are exactly, John. I mean, this has never been said before. Colonists had always identified with their individual colony. They'd identified themselves as British, right? They hadn't thought of themselves. They'd not developed this kind of collective consciousness of themselves as one unit. So American nationhood, in the first paragraph, is the most radical thing at that moment in 1776. It doesn't seem that way to us now, and I totally get that. But at the time, it is a hugely radical claim to make. But it has to be, right? For this movement to be taken seriously, and for this new nation to be recognized, which is a critical piece of its existence and durability.
Yeah, we're going to get away from Britain. Well, let's get then to
The
we
second
hold
paragraph,
the second paragraph.
the principles, yeah.
Yeah, we hold these truths to be self-evident that all men are created equal. Let's stop there. All men are created equal. What I mean, there's several glaring aspects of that.
Hmm.
The first, which is relatively easy, but I think we should talk about because some of our people who are listening may not have thought about it, is the all men.
Hmm.
What can we say about the all men part?
Yeah, I mean, so the second paragraph is at its time tremendously innovative and very different from the way that contemporaries like Jefferson or Adams are thinking about equality and liberty up to that moment, right? So this is a new way of thinking about a collective like this nation that hasn't been thought about before. But critically, this second paragraph, which this articulation of natural rights, the sort of social contract theory that comes right out of Locke, is a way of articulating the identity of the nation that's just been created in the paragraph before it. So we've got this American nation, and people are going to say, what's that? What defines the nation? What makes it different from other nations in the world? And the difference, according to TJ and the rest of the Continental Congress, is this adherence to natural rights doctrine, which is a complete departure in a world ruled by kings, right? Where monarchy is and aristocracy holds sway.
Right. And that's something worth fighting for. I mean,
Yes.
why, again, those men lined up listening to this, a lot of them are lower class, a lot of them are relatively poor. They've got a bunch of officers sitting on horses, a lot of them from Virginia, and we don't necessarily like those guys. Why am I going to fight? Well, because this is a country based on all men created equal. The other thing I was wanting to make sure we mentioned is the all men. People sometimes say, well, does that include women? Does that include African Americans?
Mhm.
One of the things that's edited out that you referred to earlier is the paragraph about the slave trade. In that paragraph, Jefferson's talking about the enslaved people, and he says men in capital letters, bold capital letters, referring to the enslaved, which tells us two things. First of all, he knows darn well there are women who are enslaved. So when
Mhm.
he's saying men, he's talking about all people.
Mhm.
And he also, you know, in two separate paragraphs, he's talking about men, all men, and he includes the enslaved in that.
Mhm.
How do you say that when you're a slave owner?
Well, I mean, at this time, again, today we interpret this, and we'll say more about this, I think, in a few minutes, along sort of universalist lines, as a very inclusive document, when in fact this is a very racially exclusive document. Jefferson is, when he's sort of outlining and previewing the nation that he has inaugurated in the first paragraph. He's really imagining this as a kind of white man's republic, unfortunately. He does not understand this new nation as having a place for Black people. And in fact, does advocate their freedom, but he advocates their freedom paired with their removal beyond the United States. So it is a dark project in that sense. It is racially exclusive. But again, the innovation here is to think horizontally about all men. Okay. So during the colonial era, again, in these other monarchical regimes, we're talking about the power, the sovereignty being vested on a very, very small piece of the population. Property holders, right, and slavers, everybody who's at the top. Um, Instead, Jefferson is, yes, imagining kind of a racialized polity, but it's all men, right? And that is a huge departure from thinking about 100 people at the top to thinking about 1 million people brought up to the top.
Right. And that gets to the other principle that's critical. We want to come back to the how do we get from all men to universalism? But the other principle that I think is in that second paragraph is governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed.
Right.
So if now again, I often when trying to explain this, I say, Jefferson's sight is limited. He sees white men. The vision is expansive,
Mm-hmm.
and we'll get to that vision.
Mm-hmm.
But if you're a white man who had not necessarily had a lot of power, their power was in the king and the nobles and the aristocracy,
Exactly.
to be told that, oh no, this is a government that applies to all of you, and our government is only legitimate not because God gives power to the king, because you, soldier, give power to the government, the consent of the government.
Exactly. Yeah. I mean, he's articulating a radical new thing here, right? A nation in which the people are sovereign. They have ultimate authority. And that is a huge departure, again, from the status quo at the time. But yes, I mean, I think we don't always, necessarily think about or understand how aristocratic these colonial societies were, in which you claimed very few political rights. You could not claim voting unless you owned a significant piece of property, excluding a huge swath of white male men. So Jefferson's small d democratic vision at this moment is to include all men in this project when previously only a fraction of them had been included.
Yeah, he has flipped the script. Power from God to the king sort of trickles
Power
down.
comes up.
power comes up. So he's flipped the script.
The
Well,
bottom-up regime, yeah.
yeah. I want to get to that legacy and those visions.
Yep.
We should mention the list of grievances. A lot of historians, especially modern historians, focus on the list of grievances, and they're the ones who really talks about the king. He has sent hither swarms of officers. He has kept among us in times of peace standing armies, for protecting them from punishment for any murders which they should commit, for cutting off our trade, for imposing taxes on us without our consent. He has this. People can decide, I suppose, for themselves whether that list is still relevant today. Um, but it is turning. We're going to turn to the king and see how he has caused these problems. So
Yeah,
let's get.
in fact, he's violated the relationship, the imperial relationship, which was the king protects his people. He doesn't try to slaughter them. And that is exactly the argument that Jefferson's making.
Yeah, and so we're going to get away from that kingly power to power of a democracy or republic. So let's get to the legacies and the impact, and how we go from that narrow sight to that what we have as an expansive vision.
Mhm.
And I think, and maybe it's, I think Jefferson knows that. I think in talking to try to understand Jefferson is a problem, but I think somewhere he knows that this is going to expand. He talks about that in that famous his penultimate letter. All eyes are opened or are opening to the rights of man. So he understands there's more work to be done.
Mhm.
What about the legacies of the Declaration?
Yeah, I mean, it's really fascinating to talk about the life of this document. Again, I think as you're sort of framing it, it goes from what we would now think is a more narrow vision for the inclusion of all white men to being something even more expansive and even transcendent. And that is done through the work of reformers and abolitionists in the 19th century who think of the Declaration in those terms. They don't think of it in the way that Jefferson did. They think of it as a kind of mission statement, the nation's commitment to these natural rights principles of all men are created equal. Um, so in the 19th century, one of those legacies is this kind of universalist reading which sees the Declaration as the kind of touchstone of an inclusive, expansive, and progressive nation, right? Very different from what Jefferson was thinking at that moment in 1776. But there's another legacy that we don't often talk about, and that's its state building legacy. So, dozens of new countries declaring their independence from the French Empire, from the Spanish Empire, um, from the Dutch Empire in the 19th century actually crib from the Declaration. They reiterate their key principles in their own efforts to declare independence from those empires.
Which is extraordinary. Again, today we sort of say, of course, but it's truly extraordinary. Here's this new country at that time still relatively weak, and has gotten rid of a king and set itself up in a democracy. And for these countries to be taking that language and using it, and of course, folks at Monticello are very proud of saying over 100 nations.
Right. Yeah,
In
it becomes a model for state building efforts in the
Yeah,
19th and 20th centuries, right? Yeah.
and absolutely, and places we don't. We were talking earlier, Ho Chi Minh and Mao Zedong love the Declaration of Independence. They say,
Yeah.
yeah, that's what we're fighting for. That's exactly what we're fighting for. So, but let's go back to the universal aspect.
Yeah.
Seneca Falls, the women. So, and I shouldn't. That's 1848. Almost immediately, abolitionists are quoting this
Yeah.
language. Women at Seneca Falls, Frederick Douglass, Martin Luther King. How does that become America's creed?
Yeah, I mean, one of the reasons I love talking about the Declaration, and we can find it endlessly fascinating, right, is that its meaning is contested, right? Jefferson is thinking about it right in 1776 as a tool of war, as a way to garner international recognition, articulate this nation. Other people are thinking of it very differently. One particular abolitionist, Lemuel Haynes, who's actually a member of the New Hampshire militia, I think it is, writes a pamphlet about the Declaration, imagining it as being really a kind of commitment to equality and liberty for all people, including people of color. So, as early as that date, there are other people sort of taking the meaning of the Declaration in a very different direction. I will say it's not until the 19th century that abolitionists and reformers, like leaders of the women's rights movement, really cement that different interpretation of the Declaration along those universalist lines. But it does begin to appear very early. And of course, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, the Seneca Falls Convention in 1848, literally cuts and pastes, those first few paragraphs from the Declaration, but includes all men and women, right? So it's clear that this has become a kind of script for inclusion of marginalized or excluded people in the nation by the 19th century.
Absolutely. And we're going to want here in a few moments to get to questions and answers. So if people have them, I certainly encourage you to put them in the box for questions and answers. We have some that people had submitted previously, but I think this is a good place, this expansion. I'm always struck by Martin Luther King's reference to it as a promissory note. It's a promissory note. So we're not there. We haven't collected on that promissory note, but it's a promise of what we can be. As I earlier alluded, I think Jefferson, again, we can't really get in his head, but I'm always struck by what Lincoln says about the Declaration. And Lincoln, who's a great Jeffersonian and a great devotee of the Declaration, I mean, that's the core of the Gettysburg Address in 1863. His quote, "All honor to Jefferson," who has this abstract truth that he's going to articulate. And I like to think that Jefferson in some way knew that, as I said, his sight is limited, but the vision is expansive. And he's used this language, which we still, today, people will be reading. I encourage anybody who's listening, with your family, read the Declaration of Independence on July 4th. It's an extraordinary document. And
I make my students read it out loud, for better, for worse.
well, as you say, it's intended to be read out loud. And by the way,
for that very reason, yeah.
Yeah, as Christa says, that's not imagining. If you actually look at the Dunlop broadside, we know that Jefferson had, because he was not a very good public speaker.
Yeah, he's a terrible public speaker.
He's terrible. So he had set it up knowing that this may have to be read out loud, that, gee, I might have to read parts of this out loud. And he had intended it to have that kind of a force with people. And now I forgot, for our people at UVA, we've been talking about, do you want to put up the first two questions, or put up the first and then the second question? We've been talking about, is this a document primarily focused on domestic or international? And we're very interested in what the people listening may think about that. And then once people have a chance to answer that, perhaps we can go on to some of the questions and answers that we can talk about. But Dana, go ahead and put up the second question in a few moments as well, about those principles. Which of those principles is really critical at the time and to us today? But let's go ahead and turn to some of the questions and answers. Of course, people are very interested about where does Jefferson get the language and who is he collaborating with? Now, you talked about this a little bit before, Christa.
Well, he does say, "I turn to neither book nor pamphlet." So he's trying to, sort of inflate his own ability a bit. We know that wasn't a reality, but yes.
Well, although, I think one of the problems, people say, well, who did Jefferson turn to? The problem is we're talking about Thomas Jefferson. This is a guy who read everything.
Sure.
He's got an extraordinary library. We know the one that you didn't mention in your earlier list of Locke and Vattel and so on, George Mason.
Yeah.
He's absolutely looking at George Mason because in Virginia is in the process of adopting its new constitution. And Article 1 of that Constitution, of the Declaration of Rights in the Virginia Constitution, largely written by George Mason, all men, what's the exact language? All men are created equal. And then it gets amended later.
Yes.
But
Yes. I would actually suggest that the figure who has the biggest, who's being cribbed from is actually Jefferson himself. And that is because he's actually writing his own draft of the Virginia State Constitution at the same time that he's writing the Declaration of Independence. And the list of all of the sort of tyrannies of the king, that's cut and pasted from his draft of the Constitution. So the bulk of that document is something he's already read, written for this new state constitution that he inserts in the Declaration.
he inserts in the Declaration.
Yeah,
That's true. And then he's got Mason, because again, the draft of Mason's Declaration of Rights is published in
right.
Philadelphia in June. Uh,
Absolutely.
and then that language, by the way, Mason's language, all men are created equally. And I'm having a brain freeze. The language is just slightly different, but it's the same point. That gets picked up in the Massachusetts Constitution, which then, in the famous Quock Walker case, leads to abolition in
Mhm.
Massachusetts.
Yeah.
Um,
But I think, it's worth just underscoring here that Jefferson's great strength is his ability to synthesize, right? He's taking all of these different ideas from Mason, from Vattel, from Locke, and he's putting them together in this sort of really eloquent, multifaceted treatise. And it really is extraordinary.
yeah, to synthesize and to write so well. And he said, as you say, he says that. He says, I don't have any new ideas here. He said, but I'm expressing the American mind. And in
Right.
many respects, that's true. John Adams certainly thinks that was true.
Sure.
Okay, wait, another question of something we were going to talk about and we skipped over. So I'm glad we have a
Oh.
question. Um, Pursuit of happiness.
Hmm.
The question was, is that realistic in our day and age? But let's stop for a moment. What Locke, life, liberty, and property.
Hmm.
Thomas Jefferson, life, liberty, pursuit of happiness. What's Jefferson doing? What's he thinking about?
Well, I'm not, I'm not a mind reader of Jefferson, but happiness is a much more expansive term than property. Um, I think he means that by sort of being a part of this new American nation, that people will be able to pursue projects, many of them maybe sort of property driven or capitalistic, without fear of retribution or restriction from a government or from a king, which is what had previously constrained these folks during the imperial crisis.
Well, and I think that pursuit of happiness, in my mind, is very much about being part of that community, participating.
Mhm.
I'm always struck Jefferson's when I used to do tours at Monticello. Of all the cankers of human happiness, none corrodes with so silent yet so baneful an influence as indolence, laziness. So if you're not participating, if you're not active in the
Mhm.
community, you can't be happy.
Right, yes. And it's really important that he imagines this as a collective project, right? It's not a libertarian sort of individual project
Yeah,
precisely because there's no top-down force holding this people together anymore, right? It's their affection, their happiness, their bonds with one another. Those are tenuous links, right? And they can only really be sustained through love, actually,
absolutely. So this Jeff
and
Rosen and
happiness. Yeah.
others, yeah, that is very much part of being a community. Um, well, I want to. We should touch on, and we're going to have way too many questions we can answer. What happens with the? You've alluded to the slave trade language, and we have a question about that. What happens with that?
Yeah, I mean, so Jefferson writes, I mean, if any of you have read it, right, it's this very sort of vitriolic paragraph in which Jefferson essentially characterizes George III as a slave trader, right? He is the reason for the transatlantic slave trade. He is the reason for the trauma and violence that's been exacted against these trafficked Africans. And he brings it to the Committee of Five and then to the Continental Congress, and they're like, no way. You cannot say that. That is a step too far. Again, this is from the kind of cohort in the Congress that really, even at this moment, thinks that there is a potential reconciliation with Britain that's going to happen. Um, but a lot of people certainly cite this as sort of anti-slavery convictions that should have been inserted in that declaration and are a huge omission because they were deleted.
Well, and I think that's right. So the there are compromises that are made. There's compromises made in the Constitution. Um, Someone asks about the third sentence. Of course, it's hard to tell what's the third sentence in the second paragraph because Jefferson's use of grammar and punctuation is always so idiosyncratic. I think they're referring to that whenever any form of government becomes destructive of those ends, it is the right of the people to alter or abolish it. Um, and we have similar questions on the relevance of the Declaration today. One of the things, I think we were discussing this in some ways when we were talking about taxation without representation,
Mm-hmm.
that your right to abolish the government, your right to revolution, is when you can no longer have any constraints. Again, Patrick Henry talks about this in his famous speech in March 1799. People were very upset at that point about the Alien and Sedition Acts, attacks on freedom of the press. And someone asks him, don't we have a right of revolution? And Henry says, whoa, this is Patrick Henry. This is Patrick Henry. Give me liberty, give me death. And he said, whoa. He says, you got a right to vote.
Mm-hmm.
You got a right to vote. You go to the ballot box, and yes, it can always revolt, but if you do that, you're going to end up with a monarchy.
Mm-hmm.
So it's really critical to understand that declaration is about when you don't have any control of your government, when the king and the nobles are telling you what to do, they're taxing you, and you don't have any control.
Yeah, they're essentially creating anarchy. That's sort of what Jefferson is saying, and not adhering to the rule of law. And that offers an opportunity for revolution. But certainly the big term here is legitimacy. They are so concerned that this be seen as a legitimate separation with the British Empire and not as an illegitimate one. And one of the reasons that they try to sort of shore up that legitimacy is to pass new state constitutions immediately after the Declaration. Because I think a point we don't always think about is the fact that the Declaration creates a legal vacuum, right? There's no more British law. There's an absence of law in the separation from Britain. So all of these delegates run back to their now home states, like Jefferson, and pass these new state constitutions to ensure that law, as Thomas Paine said, law is king, right?
Absolutely. And so that's what, that people often will ask, well, what is the right of revolution? Well, the right of revolution is when you don't have those legal recourses. And again, Patrick Henry, of all people, makes that clear. We also have some questions about the Declaration and the Constitution. It's not, they're different documents. I mean, the Constitution is creating this legal regime, which we're bound by as Americans. But the Declaration is not really irrelevant, I would say, in answer to that question. The Supreme Court has, on a number of occasions, cited the Declaration, recognizing first the aspect that Christa is talking about, that it does create the nation. I mean, it is the constitutive document.
Yes.
They've also recognized those principles in the Amistad case, in the case dealing with the enslaved people who took over the Amistad. They quote the Declaration in reaching that decision. So it's not certainly irrelevant, but it doesn't have, it's not the laws. As you say, the laws come later. The constitutions come later.
Yeah, well, the critical thing, and I understand why folks want to make the connection with the federal Constitution, of 1789, but think in that moment of 1776, right? Declaring independence for this powerful empire, you know, we're in the absence of law. What needs to happen? Well, yes, as I said a few moments ago, new state constitutions establishing the rule of law within these new states, but also a constitution. Folks forget that the Articles of Confederation and Perpetual Union, which is written in 1777, is the first Constitution of the United States. This is the larger compact that's going to hold those states together under a new legal regime.
Right. And then we're gonna have 10 years of figuring out, a little more than 10 years, figuring out exactly what that legal regime looks like.
Exactly, but you got to see the Declaration in connection, in conjunction with the state constitutions and the articles, which is, just to be clear, the first constitution of this country.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I want to get to, someone asks about the first draft. They mentioned a PBS show on the revolution. So the first draft was very different because it was more pro-king, which I don't, they love the king. I don't think so. I think the big difference, I mean, I know of two differences. The one you've just discussed,
Mhm.
which is the slavery language gets removed. The other is actually Jefferson's harder on the king in some respects than, or harder on the British than people, because he talked about our unfeeling brethren in
Mhm.
Britain. Because he's mad. He's
Well, the phrase "the last stab of agonizing affection" gets to the heart of the betrayal that Jefferson feels, not just from the king, but from the British people, and that is really destructive to him. Yeah,
absolutely. And that gets taken out because members of the Congress realize, well, wait a minute, we may need those British people.
right. As allies.
Yeah, and ultimately that proves true, because certainly after Yorktown, the king wants to keep fighting.
Mhm.
And there are a lot of people in Britain want to keep fighting, and it's really gee, we can imagine this in our own circumstances when citizens start getting fed up with the war and start saying we got to stop, this war has gone on too long. That kind of thing could happen at that time. So I don't think, I think to the question, I don't think the draft was kinder to the king. If anything, it was more pointed to the
Oh yeah,
British people.
but also remember how much this sucker changed, right? So 47 changes from the Committee of Five, right? So Jefferson's the principal author, but there are five people tasked by the Congress with coming up with this draft. And then when it reaches Congress, there are 39 more edits. So Jefferson, who's actually quite thin-skinned about, criticism like this, has to endure like all this crossed out language, substitutions. I mean, it is very different from what he hashed out originally in that boarding house.
Absolutely. So one of the questions, and I guess we might as well get to it, that we have is, if the anti-slavery provision had not been removed,
Mhm.
and again, this is where we're speculating, would Southern colonies have refused to join?
I don't think they were worried about Southern colonies at this point in time. That's really the issue of the Constitutional Convention of 1787, so more than a decade into the future. The audience that they're worried about is really the British, um, the Parliament, and other sort of leading figures in Britain. They're not worried necessarily about kind of fracturing of the colonies at that moment.
Well, interesting. Somebody, I read something just the other day. We don't want to get too much into the Constitution, but the Constitution, of course, has the provision saying you cannot eliminate the slave trade until 1808.
Mhm.
And so it was 20 years after the Constitution's drafted. Um, Britain eliminates the slave trade in 1807, the year before it can be eliminated in America. And I saw someone making the argument that, well, actually, it's because the American Constitution basically says we're going to eliminate the slave trade in 20 years. We can't do it yet, but we're going to.
Mhm.
That helps propel Britain in 1807.
But potentially, but the big project of and I think we want to be a bit careful here about anti-slavery versus anti-slave trade because actually
Yes,
nothing
yes.
is said about slavery, it's just the trade. What happens almost immediately is that all the new states pass legislation banning the transatlantic trade. Virginia does so in 1779. Every state, but Georgia and South Carolina does so in the sort of immediate revolutionary period. Georgia and South Carolina eventually follow suit by 1789. Um,
Yes.
so every state, so this is not a national declaration, but every state has banned that traffic. And that's a
And
huge
in,
precedent. Yeah.
yeah, well, and in 1792, the Virginia law on manumission, and we suddenly have a huge increase in manumission. We don't want to go. We could be here all day talking about slavery, but there is the Revolution mentioned the Massachusetts Constitution and the Quock Walker case. So there is this major movement. Something happens in the 19th century, which I know you're an expert on, and what happens with slavery in the 19th century. But we won't go there. We're not going to. We'll be here all day. We'll be here all day if we get into the 19th century. Maybe a few more questions before our time runs out. What about Native Americans? One of the questions was, what about Native Americans in the Declaration?
Yeah, I mean, so the Native Americans are mentioned again, as we were talking about the Declaration's one of its key tasks in 1776, right, is to mobilize, especially white men, to fight against these enemies. So Native Americans are mentioned as, quote, merciless savages, right? So what Jefferson means here in using this sort of derogatory language toward Native people is to gin up support for fighting against Native peoples, who have been involved in these sort of endless skirmishes with expansionist white British Americans for decades. So Jefferson's playing on that fear of Native American attack, especially in the sort of borderlands region of these colonies, cum states. But he is not thinking of Native peoples as part of this national project. And they don't want to be, actually, right? They see themselves as sovereign nations unto themselves. And later there'll be an assimilationist Indian policy. But at this moment in 1776, Jefferson is drawing upon colonial colonist fears of Native attack and Native violence to try to get them to fight for the patriot side. But Native peoples at this moment are actually calculating which side should I join? And 90% of Native peoples join the British.
Yeah, they understand what's gonna happen, and
Yeah, because, right, it's the British who, through the Proclamation of 1763, create between the Appalachian Mountains and the Mississippi River what they term an Indian Reserve, over which the king will be the sole authority. So it's the British Empire who's, quote unquote, sort of protected Native people's homelands, whereas it's these colonists who want to expand and move into these homelands. So they almost all of them ally with the British for that reason.
well, why don't we one last question, because I think this is going to take us a few minutes to
Okay.
discuss, and we can wrap up. And there's several questions that I think go to this. Several of our listeners had previously asked, how do we grow a new generation of leaders who live out the Declaration and sacred honor, and how do we encourage a love of history for the future generations? I mean, we're talking about the Declaration of Independence. Both of us have recommended people read it. Um,
Mhm.
but do you have thoughts on that?
Yeah. Well, I mean, the thing that's sort of amazing that's baked into um, to Jefferson and to his approach to this era is progress, is improvement. He does not view the Revolutionary era or his generation as representing like the golden era of American history. In fact, he thinks it's its low point. And he imagines by embracing the principles in that second paragraph, the nation generationally is going to improve and progress and be ever more representative of these principles of liberty and equality. But for him, the change happens generationally, right? Um, that's when the progress happens. But I think it's critical to remember that Jefferson and his contemporaries are looking up and looking forward from 1776. They're not saying this is the best, this is the
Or
epitome
with it.
of these principles. Far from it. He knows that those principles aren't present
Absolutely.
at that moment, but he's hoping fervently that they will be applied and embraced in future time.
This is, I tell people, this is why we call them enlightenment statesmen. And I tell
Yeah.
people when I was a grad student, people would talk about the Enlightenment and you'd nod your head, you'd say, oh, yeah, I had no idea what the Enlightenment was. But what you're talking about is the critical thing. It's all about progress. It's all about we're going to do better because we're going to learn, we're going to be educated. I think the other aspect of this, how do we do better? How do we train a new generation? How do we have a love of history? I would go back to that discussion we were having about the pursuit of happiness. This participating in the community is such a critical part of that. We had a question, someone talking about pursuit of happiness, about access to the Western lands. And yeah, there's a lot of ways to pursue happiness, but it's so tied to this idea of virtuous citizens coming together,
Mhm.
participating in the community. As some the listeners may know, I did a lot of work on religious freedom over the years. And when you do religious freedom, one of the things that is striking is the recognition of how church attendance is declining dramatically in America. And I'm not going to talk about that per se. That's your minister can talk about that. Um, but at the same time, participation in these community organizations, in the Rotary, in the Lions Club, in the JCs, and the Kiwanis, and the Women's Club, is declining. And I think, as you say, we can't quite put ourselves in Jefferson's mind or speak for Jefferson, but I think one of the critical lessons of the Declaration and of the Revolutionary era, and if we are going to have a new group of citizens who live out those principles, it's got to be by first and foremost participating. We've
Absolutely.
got to
Uh,
participate. We've got to vote. Absolutely, but we also have to participate in our community. We have to find a way to do that, whether that's participating with certainly church, if that's of your inclination, but participating in these civic organizations, participating in events like this.
And
This is
especially on July 4th, to be honest. Like Jefferson imagined the American Revolution as not finishing in 1783. He imagined a permanent revolution. In other words, this revolution is so central to American collective consciousness, to their identity, that it has to be permanent in the minds of the people for generations going forward. And to remember that and to remind themselves, he thinks that they need to, perform and remember and enact traditions on July 4th and other holidays that keep alive what he called the spirit of 76. Because without this knowledge of the spirit of 76, the American people will splinter, fracture, and the nation will collapse.
this is a good point, and brings us right back to where we started. The first and foremost, I'm glad you pointed that out. Thing to do is to do something with the 250th. A party's great. Let's have a birthday party for the Declaration. But this is really an opportunity. I know a lot of our listeners know Peter Onif, who was both your advisor and my advisor. And Peter had said to someone, "This is our moment as historians to realize the power of that memory and that commemoration. And let's use the 250th for something other than having a party and take the opportunity to think about these principles." So
Yeah.
if our friends from UVA, if you could put up the results of the survey, I'm sorry I didn't ask for those earlier, but people might be interested in what people thought about that. Um, and then we can thank all of our listeners. Althea?
Yep, I'm here, John. And Krista, that was Fantastic. What a great way to spend an afternoon learning from two scholars who are passionate about this topic. That was fun. And I could listen to you guys all day long. What also this reminded me of is Summer Jefferson Symposium, right, John? Where you're spending evenings talking about Jefferson, kind of getting in his head and getting in those other historian heads. I love it. So thank you both. Thanks for sharing your depth of knowledge with us. And we just love learning from you. So thank you, thank you, thank you. And you've inspired us to take a deeper look at this document and to keep it forefront in our minds. So, audience, thank you for joining us today. We appreciate your time and your interest in this program. John and Krista, if you'll go ahead and sign off or head to the backstage for us, that would be great. Audience, we invite you to take advantage of Speaking of America, the docuseries, to continue learning and to honor the America's 250th anniversary. The university has assembled a free collection of some of America's greatest speeches. To register to watch the videos and the upcoming capstone conversation for this program, join us on June 25th. Go ahead and visit our website at engagement.virginia.edu/learn. While there, go ahead and check out our Lifetime Learning's Thoughts from the Lawn blogs and all of our other online resources. Again, audience, thank you for joining us. Krista and John, thank you for engaging with us and teaching us today. That was thrilling. Everyone, be well.